Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I'm going to be answering the question, is it better to study hard or easier music? Now this is a question that I get quite a lot, and so I thought it'd be a great one to answer in today's video. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Okay, so I have basically 5 different points that I want to make in this video. The first 2 are more general pieces of advice that I think are important to mention, and then number 3, 4, and 5 are more actionable advice that could be applied to your practicing today, tomorrow, and moving forward. So the first concept that I want to talk about is that easy versus hard isn't really important when you get to a certain point in your studies. And what I mean by that is I used to think in terms of easy versus hard a lot. And as I developed my skill and became, a more mature pianist, I stopped thinking in terms of that. Obviously, you still want to build technique, or if you say, gosh, my double thirds aren't where they should be, maybe you could study harder pieces, arguably, that, would involve training in that technique. But it becomes less of something you focus on when you get to a certain point. So I think that it's important to not solely think in terms of easy versus hard, right? A lot of times people say, oh, that piece is way too easy, I couldn't play that. And I think that this is really an incorrect way of thinking about it. And if you focus too much in that regard, it's going to stifle your progress. One of my favorite pieces is Edward MacDowell's To a Wild Rose from his Woodland Sketches. And it's a very simple piece. It's a very easy piece, but I wouldn't hesitate to program it into a recital. Plus, when you're playing a bunch of really big pieces, it's nice to have something that's a lot easier so you can sort of, take a break, so to speak. So I wanted to mention that. Now, number 2 is similar, and that is to beware of the trap of only studying hard music. And what I mean by that is that if you are mainly working on your own, I think most of these questions, or most of these answers rather, are going to be most helpful to people who are studying on their own, or maybe haven't been able to take lessons in a while due to COVID, or taking online lessons. And sometimes online lessons can be somewhat difficult if you aren't taking lessons with someone who has a lot of experience. Really, what I mean by this one is it's really easy to get into the trap, and I've seen students of mine fall into this before, where they think that, again, like the previous thing I mentioned, they can only study harder music because that's what's going to help them develop their skill more, and those other pieces are too easy, and if I really want to be a great pianist, I have to play all this really difficult music. And the problem is, of course, if you're not prepared to play those harder pieces, that's not going to be successful. So for instance, if you think, gosh, I really want to play Chopin Opus 10 number 2, but maybe you can't actually play a really smooth, really good chromatic scale with, the traditional fingering, let alone with fingers 3, 4, and 5, while playing other intervals with fingers 1, 2, and 3. If you can't actually play a chromatic scale with the traditional fingering, how on earth are you going to accomplish that etude? Now, you might be thinking, well, I'll slowly, over the course of years build up to that. But the problem with this, of course, is that you're sort of neglecting a lot of other things by focusing only on these really difficult pieces. And so it's important to make sure that you don't think in terms solely of easy and hard. And hopefully you can kind of see that with these examples. Now, number 3 is to ask yourself, why this piece? So again, this is probably mostly going to be helpful for people who are studying on their own, or again, haven't been able to take lessons in a while, or, some sort of circumstance like that. But really, what I mean by that is you have to ask yourself, why do you want to study this particular piece, whatever it is? If you think to yourself, again, let's take that same example, the Chopin, Opus 10 number 2, you think, well, I really want to learn this piece because it's just a really cool piece, whatever. What you actually need to think of is you need to think in terms of, am I capable of accomplishing this piece? What technical challenges do I have to overcome to be able to approach this piece? Again, if you can't play, scales faster than 112 to the quarter note, 4 notes per click, then how are you going to play, say, the Moszkowski Etudes Opus 72, which are going to require you to play 50 to 60% faster? Or how are you going to be able to play most of the Chopin Etudes? Okay, so you have to think in terms of, what do I have to accomplish before I play these big pieces? And that actually really gets to the heart of, I think, the answer to this question. Don't think so much in terms of easy and hard, but think like a teacher would think, okay? So for instance, I had a student in the past and they were struggling with rhythms specifically. And I don't remember what the rhythms were that they were struggling with, 3 against 4, or switching from duplets to triplets and back and forth, right? So they were playing some of these big pieces when they first came to me. And so I had them play pieces that were technically much easier, but so they could really focus on rhythm, playing with the metronome, and getting a sense of timing sort of internally, so that then they could move away from that, play the more difficult music. And this student was completely fed up after a few months, because their complaint was, well, I've already played pieces at this level, and so this is like kid stuff. What am I doing, And I tried to explain to them basically the idea that, well, yeah, you did play pieces like this, but when you played the harder pieces, you couldn't really play them. Your rhythm was all over the place, your tempo was all over the place. And even when I had them playing the much easier music, they just couldn't play with the metronome, and they weren't willing to put in the time and effort to really fix the rhythms and get them really straight and whatever. Now, that was a little bit of a different circumstance, but my point with that is that they were trying to play all these really big pieces, but they weren't thinking about it in terms of like a teacher. What do I have to accomplish to be able to play these big pieces? They were solely thinking of it in terms of, I just want to play that piece. And so if you want to play these big pieces, you have to think about my scale technique, my arpeggio technique, my octave technique. If I've never really worked on octaves, then maybe I can't play all these big pieces that have these huge octave passages that are supposed to be, very fast. Practice playing octaves, octave scales, octave arpeggios, and try to develop these technical gestures to help you play those things. Another thing, if you can't play scales faster than 144 without your arms falling off, as it were, because of the buildup of tension, or even at 144, then don't try to play these big pieces. Try to solve that technical problem that's causing you to have so much tension. Okay, so you have to really think like a teacher if you're choosing your own repertoire. And then point number 4 is that you should think of your piano technique or your technical abilities like a rubber band. Okay, so the idea here is that if we have a rubber band and I'm using it for something, if I don't stretch it at all, it's not really worthwhile, right? Why wouldn't I just use a piece of string? However, if you stretch a rubber band too far, it will break or it will stretch out. And so think of your piano technique in the same way. You should be stretching it to a degree, okay? If you never stretch your abilities at all, you're not going to grow as a pianist. However, realize that there is a point at which you can actually stretch your abilities too much, okay? If you've never really played any really big pieces and then you're going to play all the Opus 10 Chopin Etudes, you're not going to be successful. That's going to be a very unsuccessful endeavor. So it's important to, think of it in terms like that. And this, of course, goes back to the previous point, which is you have to think like a teacher. What technical abilities do I need to develop, etc. Okay? So this actually goes into the next point, which is to study many different things. And I would suggest, like I mentioned in the previous point, to stretch your abilities somewhat. Make sure you're not always studying music that's basically the same technical level, okay? However, you should make sure that you're not always studying certain things. Let's say you say that your technical abilities will allow you to move on from Kuhlaus, sonatinas and the easier Mozart sonatas, let's say. So you're going to play a Beethoven sonata. Great. Okay? Don't only study Beethoven sonatas or pieces at that level. Play some easier pieces, maybe play one piece that's a little bit harder, that of course has technical challenges that you've already approached and you've been working on, and you feel confident that you can actually accomplish those in the piece. Because after all, if you can't accomplish those technical demands that a piece puts forward, then playing is not really going to be all that successful. And just thinking, well, I'm going to just play it for the next 10 years and eventually it'll be good, is not really a good strategy, in my opinion. And then, of course, you should also study things like scales, arpeggios, chords, learn inversions and all the keys, be fluent in that regard, learn theory, get some books, read about theory. That's actually something that is really lacking in most piano studies. And then also sight reading. That's a really big one. If you can sight read extremely well, then you can learn these bigger pieces that have more notes that are harder to read, because it sort of prepares you in that regard. And it goes back to, of course, chords, scales, and arpeggios study as well, and all the keys. If you're fluent in all the different keys, right, then when you play a piece of music that's in G flat, it's going to be much easier to read, it's going to be much easier to approach, or a piece of music that's going through a bunch of different keys, like a circle of fifth sort of progression. You'll sort of already be in tune to what's happening, and you'll recognize these keys as they come along. So I think that tips 3, 4, and 5 are really actionable, and this would be my direct advice specifically to anyone who is trying to learn mostly on their own, or maybe they just don't have the ability to take lessons right now because of whatever reasons, financial or geographical location, or whatever the issue is. I think those will be most helpful to anyone who's at that place. But even, if you are taking lessons, I think that it's important to realize these things and think about them in terms of why your teacher is approaching things the way they are. And ultimately, I think that it's important to be mindful of how you think about repertoire, how you think about technique and those other things. And oftentimes people have the perspective of, I'm just going to push my way through this problem, okay? I want to play La Campanella. It has these huge leaps, it has octaves, it has fast repeated notes, and I've never really experienced any of those technical challenges, but all of a sudden, I'm going to play it. That's not going to be particularly effective. You might play it, but will you play it well? Probably not. Thinking about it in terms of that will help you be much more successful in the long run. So I hope that these thoughts and ideas were helpful and informative. I wanted to make this video because, like I said, this is something that I've been asked a lot in the past, and I think it's a really, really good question, and there are many different pitfalls related to this question that people can fall in. So hopefully everyone watching this can avoid those and make terrific progress through this year in their piano studies. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.